Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for a webinar about 4 strategies for a smarter college search. Personally excited to hear Cozy speak a little more about the college search, all that entails in the FAFSA, because guess what? The FAFSA should be top of mind for all parents who have kids in college or soon will be in college. And I tell you, college is a lot different today than when I applied for college. I found in cleaning out my mother's house, my old 2-page UT Austin application, and it was really simple back then. Very straightforward. I think the essay might have been optional, I'm not sure, but it was really easy. Easy to just find the paperwork and apply, and it feels a whole lot more complex today. So I'm excited to have Cozy with us, and happy to share a little bit about her. Education and networking are a way of life for Cozy. At College Inside Track, she runs both the parent events as well as the professional development training for those who work with families who have high school students. She speaks nationally about college search, training financial and other professionals. Cozy is excited to connect with organizations and families interested in learning more about the complex college process. She's a mom of 5 with very different goals for college, so she is no stranger to the college search challenge. So please help me welcome Cozy. We're excited to have her. The host, I'm Dave Ragan, president of Grunden Financial Advisory. And what we find is many of our clients, their wealth is more than just numbers, like it carries a greater purpose. And we're fortunate to be able to help guide those clients for one of those greater purposes about wealth transfer, as we would refer to it in a client meeting. But it's about trying to provide education for kids or grandchildren. So with that, I'd like to invite Cozy to take it away and help educate us about the college application process and all things related.
Thanks. Thanks for the invitation. I do love that idea, Dave, that college really is a gift, if you will, to help people really think about creating a basis for wealth in their either student's life or in their grandstudent's life with their grandparents. So I love that idea of kind of creating a legacy, right? An education legacy that creates wealth by itself. If you're unfamiliar with College Inside Track, the company I work for, we've been helping families navigate the college search process for 20 years now. The goal here is always the same. We want students to find right fit schools. And what we mean by that is the right academic fit for the student, the right social fit for the student, because kids are also people on a college campus, not just students. And then the right financial fit for the family, whatever that looks like. We don't have an opinion about how much you should pay for college. We just want to make sure that the colleges that make it to the list fit the game plan that you've established with Dave. And so one of the things that we just find to be true is when you get families really good information, one of the things that happens is it just naturally brings down the stress level that sometimes starts to build when your kids are in high school because they're starting to become adults, right? And so there's just this natural kind of breaking apart that starts to happen. And then you add in the stress of a college search, and sometimes there's some of this that goes on. And so one of the things we strive to do is just kind of bring down that level of stress by, I always tell people we put a cone of silence over the family. All right, so tonight we're going to talk about 4 strategies for a smarter college search. These strategies are going to include covering some of the trends that are impacting both acceptance but also cost. We will talk about the use of the FAFSA and other financial profiles. We'll also talk about how the list of selective schools continues to grow, the impact that grade inflation is having on acceptance rates and costs, but that leads you down a path of testing as well. And so we'll talk about how those two kind of talk to each other. And then the final thing, when you leave here today, you'll understand what early decision is and why you might like to use it or why you might not want to use it. I always think it's helpful to get a little state of the college landscape today. One of the things that we see if we look over the last 30 years is that colleges have increased their tuition rates far beyond most other industries. They even have increased their cost rates compared to their peers. So if we compare flagship schools like University of Texas to other style of schools, either the Texas state system or the private schools in the state of Texas, even or nationwide, what we see is that our flagship schools far outpace both of those groups. You can see University of Texas has increased their pricing by 544% in the last 30 years. I'm up here in Minnesota. No, it's not always cold. Our University of Minnesota, our flagship school has gone up 570%. But if you look at Louisiana State, they're sitting under that national average at 353%. So it's super intriguing to see kind of what's happened. What you'll see nationally is that public schools, big picture, so the big and the flagship schools combined, the state and university systems have gone up about 213% in that same time frame. So you can see the UT system has almost doubled that. And then when we look at our private schools, those schools have actually only gone up by about 415%. So UT also outpacing that, as have most of the flagship universities. When I sit down with families and we chat college, I do this just about every day of the week. It's one of my favorite things to do. I ask the student, tell me some schools you're kind of sort of interested in. And I'm here to tell you that your kids are bubbling up schools that fit into the pricing category of these top 4 or 5 schools. The thing I want to point out are the schools at the bottom. You can see University of Texas hanging out at $35,000 a year for residents, almost $70,000 a year if you are a non-resident. And those are pretty equivalent prices to what we see nationwide. I haven't looked what our current round of seniors are getting back from UT Austin because it's so hard to get into UT Austin if you're a non-resident, but I haven't checked our Texas kids yet to see what kind of pricing they're getting. But I can tell you University of Minnesota next year going up to $40,000 from 35, so more than a 10% increase. And it would not surprise me if we see that happen at some of these other flagship schools. All right, we're going to do a little play it long at home quiz. What percentage of kids who go off to college do you think learn this is not the place for me and end up changing schools? So they go from one 4-year university to another. Is that 6% of students, 14%, 25, 38, or 42%? Turns out national transfer rates hang out at 38%. So almost 40% of kids who go off to college discover that they've made a poor choice and have to go on. Why does this matter? It matters because I've yet to meet the family who wants to overpay for a college education. And so one of the things that we see is when kids go from one 4-year school to another 4-year school, it increases the cost of their degree by about $14,000. And that's a public to public transfer, by the way. It doesn't even get the private schools involved. One of the things you should know is that of the 38% who made a poor choice the first time, almost half of those kids, 46% of those kids who changed schools once, do it yet again, going on to that third school, increasing the cost of that degree by $24,000. So it turns out one of the easiest ways to keep the cost of college down is just by finding the right fit school, right? Academic, social, and financial fit. All right, so let's talk about kinds of financial aid. And what I'm hoping to do here is actually get you in the same dictionary as the colleges. So one of the things that I see on a pretty regular basis, I do probably between 350 to 400 family meetings a year. That's a lot of families. And a whole bunch of them kick off our conversation by saying, well, we know we're not going to get any financial aid. Well, what they're actually talking about is they don't think they're going to qualify for need need-based aid. And they almost always are thinking Pell Grant, which is the federal opportunity for some need-based aid. And they're probably right about that. However, here's the deal. When colleges talk about financial aid, they're not just including need-based aid. They are actually also including merit-based scholarship dollars. So when you go out to a college website and it says the average student on our campus pays X, or the average award on our campus is X, you need to know that that number is being influenced by both of these things, but also loans, because colleges also consider the federal student loan financial aid. So really, at the end of the day, when we look at those numbers, what we see is if it's true that your family's not going to qualify for need-based aid from the college, not the federal government, but the college, then the number they're sharing with you is irrelevant. If you don't plan to take out loans, the number irrelevant. If you don't know for a fact that your student is going to get the average amount of merit aid on that campus, irrelevant. So the numbers that the schools share as their averages do not really reflect what you're going to pay on that campus. And why is that true? Because to get the average, they took the kid paying the most and the kid paying the least. So somebody there is paying sticker price, at least one kid. And at least one kid is paying nothing because they got a whole bunch of need-based aid and maybe some merit-based scholarship dollars. And so that number is being influenced. If you take the top and the bottom and you average them, right, you get something in the middle, but that middle number is being influenced by that bottom number. And so that's how it kind of skews off of what you would actually pay as a family. So I want to clarify some of the misperceptions around need-based aid so that you really understand how this works, because I find that most people don't understand really, truly how financial aid from a need perspective works. Remember, there's a whole other bucket over here called merit-based scholarship dollars, and we'll talk about that here in a couple of slides. But first, we're going to do need-based aid. When I finish with the FAFSA information, we will go ahead and take questions. So if you have some questions related to this, please do. Dave, do you want them to drop them in the chat, or what do you want people to do?
That's right.
Awesome. Okay, so to determine your need on a college campus, you're going to have to fill out at least one form. I think most of you are probably familiar. Dave mentioned this in the intro, the FAFSA form. This is the federal application, the free application for federal student aid. That's what the letters stand for. The CSS profile, on the other hand, is actually a private form. So you'll get a report back from the FAFSA. You will not get a report back from the CSS profile. Both of these kick out a number that's now referred to as the student aid index. And one of the things that you'll find is that the CSS profile is primarily used by more selective schools. It doesn't have to do with public or private. It has to do with selectivity. And the more selective a school becomes, the more likely it is that they'll be using that CSS profile. The other thing you should know is in the state of Texas, you must fill out your FAFSA form when your student is in high school. It's part of the state law. All right, so I want to break out the formula for the FAFSA, because I find that there's a lot of misperception. I get a lot of families who want to set up a family consultation because they want to talk about what they should be doing to make sure that they could maybe be need-based. And it turns out there are two groups of people that have to include their information on a FAFSA form. The first group are you guys, parents, right? And what we see, though, is that your income is substantially larger in terms of the formula than your assets are. And most people aren't willing to manipulate their income, become poorer for the purposes of FAFSA, right? What they actually want to think about is moving assets around. But it turns out, because assets are such a small part of this formula, they're going to take your total assets and multiply by 5.64%. And there are a whole bunch of them you get to leave off, and we'll talk about that here in a second. Your income, on the other hand, assessed at 47%. So yes, that means that the formula assumes, hold on to your hats, that you are willing to spend almost half of your income on your student for college, which of course is a crazy number. Nobody wants to do that. The other group of people who have to include their information are students, of course. It is technically their FAFSA, although I would not recommend having them fill it out by themselves. This is a team activity. So what we see is, for the purposes of FAFSA, if the student has assets and income, you can see it's a much higher portion, because the formula assumes if a student has these, that they are planning to spend most of it on college. So assets at a much higher rate, income at 50%. Now, here's a really interesting piece. 529 plans, which is a vehicle that you might be saving for college in, 529 plans are considered a parent asset. So at that very low 5.64%. What percentage of a 529 plan is intended for use in college? 100, right?
Like a trick question. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. 100% of it. But they are only assessing at 5.64%. So if you are saving for college, this is good, right? Don't think that somehow because you saved, you're being like knocked out on e-based aid. I'm getting penalized for doing the right thing. You're not, right? Your asset's a very small part of this picture. And by the way, if you were saving in a 529 plan, and you started when your kids were small fries, the growth on that 529 plan will far surpass this little teeny tiny 5.64%.
Mhm.
All right. If you have a third party, I've got grandparents here, but it doesn't have to be grandparents. It could be aunties, uncles, godparents, your neighbor next door who just loves your kid. Anybody who wants to help your student pay for school can do so. And it is not represented on that FAFSA at all. So if grandma and grandpa are helping, they've got their own 529 plan, beautiful. That 529 plan is never going to get reported. But here's what I would say. If you have a high schooler, no hijinks, right? No reason in most cases to suddenly have parents shift all their money into grandma and grandpa's 529 plan. For the most part, because this is such a small percentage, for the vast majority of families, their income is influencing the outcome of the FAFSA, not their assets. So in most cases, it makes no sense to start doing the mental gymnastics around where should we move money. All right, after this slide, I will be happy to take your questions. So if you have them, please drop them into the chat. This is your time. I'm happy to answer them. The FAFSA really cannot be manipulated. I've got 4 tips tonight. This is the first one. You can't really, as parents, remove yourself from the FAFSA. The days of just declaring your student independent because you don't claim them on taxes are long gone. That does not remove you from the responsibility of filling out the FAFSA form. If you do that, all you do is lose your kid credits. So don't do that. Here's the deal. At the end of the day, most of the definitions that fit independent student are not meant for 18-year-olds. They're meant for adults, like I'm married, for instance, right? Or I've already graduated from college. There are very specific bullets around who can be independent, and most 18-year-olds don't qualify. When you're filling out your FAFSA form, remember I told you there are some exemptions. So you do not need to put in retirement accounts. So 401ks, 403bs, Roth IRAs, regular IRAs, none of those need to be included. You also don't need to include your primary residence. So not your primary home. Now, if you would have rental properties, Airbnb, for instance, or if you have a fun vacation home somewhere, you do need to include the net value, so market value minus debt of those properties. If you have divorce as part of your family status, only one parent is going to fill out the FAFSA form, and the way you determine it today is based on who is financially supporting that student the previous 365 days to the day that you filled out that FAFSA form. It's not based on custody, and it is not based on tax dependency. If you have multiple kids in college, I'm sad to tell you that that will not influence the outcome of your FAFSA. So when you have 2 kids going off to college, you fill out 2 forms, one for student A, one for student B. When you fill out student A's form, your income as a parent assessed at 47%. When you fill out student B's, your income assessed, you guessed it, 47%. So if you have 2 kids going off to college, the formula is presuming you want to send almost 100% of your income off with your kids to college, which of course none of us are interested in. They did make a revision prior in the 2024 FAFSA changes. They had some rules around reporting of assets and net worth for businesses. In the budget bill that passed this summer, they did make some revisions. And one of the revisions that they made for the FAFSA specifically is that if you are a farmer, a rancher, a small business owner with fewer than 100 employees, you do not need to include your assets or the net worth of that business. So don't include that stuff if you have 100 or fewer employees. And by the way, this got changed because farmers and small business owners were up in arms. And guess what? They wrote their representatives and said this rule unfair. Please do so for bullet number 4 here. It is also equally unfair that the formula assumes that if you have many kids in college at the same time, that you want to send all your income off with them. Write your representatives. They're the ones that changed it, kind of unknowingly, by the way, and they can get it revised. They did it here. Don't include sibling 529 plans. So when you're filling out student A's FAFSA form, you only need to include the 529 plan for student A. If you have 3 kids, 3 529 plans, no need to include the siblings on this, just the student you're filling it out for. And then lastly, the one thing you should know is even if you're high net worth, you're 100% positive, you're never going to qualify for need-based aid, I still recommend filling out that form. There are a lot of schools in the country that actually increases your likelihood of success of acceptance, right? So fill out your FAFSA forms. Think about it this way. If you're a business owner and you know that this group over here can pay you, but this group over here, you have no understanding of whether or not they can pay, where do you think you're starting in terms of letting people in, right? You're probably going to start over here. So please do fill out your FAFSA forms. It can increase likelihood of acceptance. All right, let's take questions, Dave. Do you mind reading them?
Yes, I am happy to do so. I do have a few questions that that either we've come across before or that they've asked me to ask in advance. And I've got a son at UT, and just for confirmation about the prices that you have up there, it's pretty spot on
Mm.
for what we're experiencing. A question about the FAFSA. You mentioned it cannot hurt, could only help to complete the FAFSA for the first year. What about subsequent years? Say that students, no financial changes, that didn't qualify for any federal aid. Is it necessary? Is there any benefit to keep completing that FAFSA once they're already in college?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, a couple of things I want to make sure people understand. So, when you fill out your FAFSA form, it determines need at the federal level. And it's safe to say that your clients are not going to, if you have kind of a roof over your head, you're probably not going to qualify for need based aid. If you take a vacation a year, you're probably not qualified for need based aid at the federal level. The colleges, on the other hand, do their own determination. And it would not be unusual if you are middle or even upper middle income to qualify for need-based aid at some colleges around the country. So if you stay in the state of Texas, your student is going to either the Texas State, Texas Tech, any of the public institutions, UT system, any of the public state universities, colleges and universities. If you have an income over about $180,000, you're not going to qualify at those schools. But if you had Baylor on your list and you have that same income,
Yeah.
you would qualify. So that's why I think it's really important. People assume it's a crazy number of people, like 13% of people fill out their FAFSA form or something. It's insane. You 100% should fill this bad boy out. So let's say, though, you're going into year 2 and you didn't qualify for need-based aid in year 1. If you are at a private school, I would still highly recommend you fill it out because sometimes their merit-based aid has been attached to the fact that they got that form. If you're at a public institution, no need. If you didn't qualify in year one, you're not going to qualify in year two if nothing changed in your financials. Now, stuff changed for the worse, for instance, you lost a job, then I would go ahead and fill it out. The other thing I just want to mention is the FAFSA form is the application for the federal student aid, or excuse me, for the student loan. That federal loan program is not need-based. Every single student can qualify as long as they fill out their FAFSA form. And the federal student loan is the only loan a student will own by themselves. It does not require a parent co-signature. And also, by the way, your kids are not going to drown in debt by using it. Freshmen only get access to $5,500. That's it. That's all they get. Some would argue it's not enough, but 5,500 is it. 6,500 sophomore year, 7,500 junior year, 7,500 senior year. So if you add all that up, it comes to 27,000. The payback on that, about $300 a month for 10 years, right? So nobody's drowning in debt using that undergrad program.
Got it. And those numbers haven't changed for a while, if memory serves. Has it?
20 years.
20 years. Wow. Okay.
I mean, think about how much of your education $5,500 covered 20 years ago. And now think about how much it covers today. Like it barely covers books for the year. So
Yeah.
it's certainly not putting the student in a position where they are drowning in debt. And the other thing is there were pretty significant caps put on master's and PhD programs now. And
Right.
so it begs, like, I would sit down with you, Dave, if I were your client and say, help me think about this in more of a big picture way, right? You really want to be thinking about this more from maybe a 6-year opportunity, depending on what your student's thinking about going into, and stop thinking about it as a 4-year now, because the limitations now make it next to impossible for students to go get a master's without getting help from either private loans with much more expensive rates or their parents in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. All right. One more question that we fielded before, and I'd love your feedback on. Can you speak a little bit about establishing residency in another state and if that's even possible nowadays for the purpose of obtaining that in-state tuition?
Yeah. So residency is school specific. And remember, we're only talking about public institutions here because private institutions don't care if you're in state, out of state. That's not a thing. You have to be very careful before you make the presumption that you can do that. Check this out while your student's still in high school before they've fallen in love with the school, because there are schools in the country that will never allow you to be a resident. And there are other schools in the country that can't wait for you to be a resident. They do it for you. If you want to go to Utah State and University of Utah, both those schools, you're a non-resident for a year, whoop, you're an instant resident in year 2. It happens in Wyoming, happens in Montana, right? Some of the places where it's just harder for them to attract students. You'll see that happen much, much easier than places like Texas, for instance. Texas, not so interested. Because at the end of the day, if I make you a resident, you're not going to pay as much. So why would I do that? I need you to help me offset the cost of my resident kids. So in the really popular states or the really popular schools, like the University of California system, you will never be a resident, ever. In the Cal State system, on the other hand, if you've lived there for a year, you earned X amount of money, their system much more flexible. So it's system specific and even school specific in some cases.
Wow. I'm glad I asked. That's really good information. Thank you. I think that's all the questions for now.
Sounds great. All right. So let's assume, for the sake of argument today, that none of you are going to qualify for need-based aid. Good news, that doesn't mean that you have to pay full price at every single school. Instead, there's this whole other bucket, right, that we talked about, the merit-based bucket. In order to understand the merit bucket, you have to understand how schools think. You have to put on your business hats because colleges are businesses. And when they accept a student, it's a business decision. And when they decide to give away money, it's a business decision. I know that we don't think about this, right? College search is all heart and no head, but I want you to put some head into this a little bit. The challenge today is that it doesn't work like it worked back when you guys went to school. Just like the federal loan program has not changed in 20 years. Um, the way the college system works has changed incredibly in 20 years. So if you're still thinking about colleges as being in-state, out-of-state, public and private in terms of how expensive they might be, then you're playing on the 1995 game board of Let's Go to College. I really want to get you on this 2025 game board of Let's Go to College, which means you have to start thinking about colleges as being flexibly priced or inflexibly priced. And again, this is where you need to put on your hat, your business hat. The reason we can't think about schools as being in-state, out-of-state, public, and private is because you can find all of those defined schools in both of these categories, right? So you can't ever say if you leave the state, it's always going to be more expensive. You also can't say if you go to a private school, it's always going to be more expensive, because neither of those statements is true any longer. And so what you really need to try and understand, and it's hard because the colleges are not very transparent, is are they going to flex their pricing for you or are they not going to flex their pricing for you? And the easiest way to think about this is, have I heard of them? Those guys are mostly the inflexible schools. So if they're in another part of the country and you can name them off, they probably fall here. If they're in another part of the country and you've never heard of them, and this includes public institutions, they are probably here. Now, it's not exclusively true, but it's mostly true. I'm going to use my kids as our example. Dave mentioned I have 5 kids. The bottom 3 very traditional college searches. One of my kids went to our flagship university, the University of Minnesota. One of my kids went to an out-of-state state school, and one of my kids went to a private school. The least expensive of those 3, you can guess at home, was the private school. It was $10,000 less a year than our flagship school.
Wow.
Followed by the out-of-state public institution. It was $8,000 less a year. Think about this. When my daughter went to the private school, it cost us $40,000 less over those 4 years than had she just gone to the University of Minnesota. And here's her mom, when we started her search, stay in the state, go to a state school. I just presumed that was going to be our less expensive option. There is no singular option that will always be the least expensive anymore. And so you've got to get your brain out of thinking that way. And by the way, some of the most inflexible schools are our flagship schools. The University of Texas, in Louisiana, it's actually Louisiana State. It's not University of Louisiana. It's whatever the main flagship university is, right? The big state system. The other thing you should know is, unlike back in the day when you went to college, private parties like businesses do not hold the big scholarship dollars. The big scholarship dollars are held by the colleges themselves. The big money that moves the needle on the price of college is there. It is not sitting on the internet. So no Scholarship Sunday where you sit your kid in front of the laptop for 3 hours and say, go find scholarships. I talked to a family last week. They have 3 kids. We were talking about their youngest kid, but she was telling me the middle kid was diligent. She applied to 80 of these private scholarships out on the internet. She won nothing. Not a single thing. And I said to them, yep, that's pretty much the result you see. So don't have your kids out on the internet. No, I'm Italian with one blue eye scholarship, right? No, I have diabetes scholarship. Do you know how many kids apply to those, right? They're giant volumes of kids, huge waste of your time. Now, if they want to jump around locally, if they want to stop at the bank and the local Lions Club, go crazy. It's just not going to move the needle on the price of college, right? Congrats, you won $1,000. You bought books for first semester. Well done, you. And that's it. Like, it's a one-time deal in most cases. So what we see today is the way that you control the price of college, but also, by the way, control how many schools your student gets into. Both of these are true, is by your college list. You have to really work on the list first. It does not work like it used to. Like I apply to whatever schools I want, and then I figure out how to pay for them after I get in. That is a horrible strategy in today's marketplace. You have to decide what schools can help meet your financial goals. But also, if we think about acceptance, because maybe you're a family like, look, Cozy, we've saved well. We don't really care about the price of college. Okay, great. I think that's awesome. You also have to balance your list for risk. So you cannot have just high risk schools. And the way you control that is your college list, right? So it turns out the schools that make it to the list impact both acceptance, but also cost. Secondarily, and both of these next things also influence acceptance and cost, the decisions your student makes in high school and the way they tell that story through the application and essay process equals better scholarship dollars, better acceptance rates. Both things are true. So, what we're really talking about here is being a better competitive applicant. Now, here's good news. I'm not talking about every kid being a 4.0. None of, well, I had one out of five was a 4.0 kid. At the end of the day, what you really want to look for are schools where your student is in the top third of the incoming freshman class for that school. And good news, not only does that increase scholarship dollars, increase acceptance rates, it also increases graduation rates. Students who look at schools where they are in the top third of the freshman class have a 40% higher likelihood of graduating than if they go to a school where they're in the bottom third. And this is by GPA and test score. Now, your student doesn't have to be the 4.0 kid. If they're a 3.2, you want to go look for schools where a 3.2 puts them in the top third. If they're a 2.8, you want to go look for schools where being a 2.8 puts them in the top third, right? So it's not about making every kid the same kid. It's about making sure you're looking at schools where you're balanced for risk, but you also have a higher likelihood of scholarship dollars. When you think about activities, so those high school the high school decisions, courses, but also activities, quality of activities, not quantity. More is not better here. Now we'll talk more about this in a couple slides. Be demographically interesting. This is super easy to do, especially if you're a Texan. There's this super nerdy number called the student export rate that if you're in the college landscape, you talk about. This is exactly what it sounds like, percentage of kids that actually leave their state. In Texas, Texas has the lowest export rate of all states in the country, all of them. So
Wow.
it's partly because, right, you're so big, they can be 8 hours from home. Those kids that want to be far from home can do
True.
that and still be in their state. But you have a lot of kids who just want to use your state systems, which is awesome because Texas has great state systems. But at the end of the day, your kids also the most intriguing to other schools around the country. Your export rate is like 14% or something like that. Think about that. There are 3,500 colleges and universities in the country. A Texas kid could go just about anywhere and be intriguing because every school wants to say they've got one kid from all 50 states and 37 countries around the world, right? And so a kid who applies to Syracuse in New York, super interesting if they're from Texas because they just don't get that many Texas applicants. Quinnipiac never sees them. The Redlands never sees them, right? Because you guys stay where you're at. So it's super easy to be demographically interesting. Demonstrated interest is an interactive piece. At the end of the day, what are the admissions people responsible for? For putting butts in chairs, for making sure that the kids who interacted show up here as a college freshman, right? So they're trying to close a deal, if you will. There's also a nerdy name for that. But at the end of the day, what they really want is of the kids who applied, we want the highest percentage of the kids who applied to actually come here. And so they'll use scholarship dollars to intrigue that kid that they've talked to many times because they know if you've toured once, you went to accepted student programming, you stopped by their table when they were at your high school, all of those factors tell the school this kid's pretty interested in us. If we just sweeten the pot a little bit, guess what? We can lock and load them. And so that's what they do. Transcript rigor matters. At the end of the day, what colleges really want are students who will be successful freshman year. Because if you can be successful freshman year, you're probably staying all 4 years. What they want are kids who will come, elbow through a couple majors because everybody does, but still get out of here in 4 years. And so that means you have to have a successful freshman year to do that. And how can they tell that? Well, they can tell that by two things. First, transcript rigor. So the kids who have tested themselves in the college landscape in high school, whether it's dual credit or whether it's AP classes or IB classes, all of those count in this space. And you don't have to be buried. You could have just done a couple in senior year, no big deal. But those kids tend to be more successful. The other way they can tell is test scores, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. And then how you tell your story is a huge part of the deal today. These schools spend a ton of time reading essays. So saying something that's unique about you that 17,000 other kids did not also write, super important and really hard for high schoolers to do. We spend a ton of time on how do you tell your story because it's really hard. If you're an average high schooler, you're like, I'm not interesting. I don't know what to write about. All right, before we go on to early decision stuff, I thought I would stop here and take whatever questions you have.
All right. Thank you, Cozy. This has been fantastic so far. I'm curious on the you mentioned that you spent some time with students helping them edit and think through their essays. What are some of the most common mistakes that you see when students come to you with their first draft?
Yeah. So first draft issues are almost always it's written too broadly. So they're writing about the mission trip, the whole trip, right? You need to have, if you're going to use that, and that's a terrible example because that's also the classic, like poor area, don't go down that pathway. They don't want to read any more mission trip stories. Um, but really narrowly focused, right? The other big mistake that we see that people make is they might be talking about someone who has influenced their life. And it ends up being a great biography of that person, and they don't say anything about themselves, right? So it ends up being more about that person than them. And so it's really hard for high schoolers to write a great personal statement because it's not the kind of writing they do in high school classically, right? You know, give me 300 words on the person who has influenced you most in your life is a classic high school teacher thing, right? This is not that. This is tell me about you. And also, by the way, stay out of all the cliched areas, right? So, and that's probably the third mistake that we see. Like kids want to talk about their illness, the thing that kept them out of the state tournament, the mission trip they went on, and how, you know, they realized that there are poor people in the world. That's not what they're interested in hearing about, right? Think about all the things you could talk about. Sometimes kids with mental health issues want to talk about that piece, but you are not the sum total of whatever medical or mental health challenges you have, right? So there's so many cool things about kids. They just don't know how to dive in there and how to find it and how to pull it forward.
Great. Then another question I've got for you. Do schools track social media engagement with any of their applicants, or is that too far down a rabbit hole?
Oh, no, for sure they do. For sure they do.
Yeah.
The one thing I would say though is so when we talked about demonstrated interest, this is another area of demonstrated interest. The big universities, like a University of Texas, the Texas state system, those guys not doing this so much, right? Because at the end of the day, they get so many that
Yeah.
they're just not tracking it. But if you're interested in University of Dallas, they're 100% tracking that, right? If you're interested in Baylor, they're 100% tracking that. So as you get into those smaller or even mid-sized private universities, they're totally tracking that stuff.
Uh, that's neat. I'm glad I asked.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's it for questions so far. Let's keep going.
Sounds great. So let's talk about early decision. I find that parents get very confused about the different kinds of application types. Early decision often gets confused with early action. These are very different applications. Early decision is exactly what it sounds like. It's a decision. Your student has said to the school, I'm using this application to commit. And if you let me in, I will withdraw all my other applications. It is binding. There's a student right now that's being a family that's being taken to court by Tulane because the student backed out and not for financial reasons. They found out that they had applied early decision to multiple schools. So at the end of the day, you get to use this one time. For that reason, be strategic. don't waste it on a school where it's only giving you a 10% bump. Last year, Wake Forest took 58% of their freshman class out of early decision. 58%. Cornell, 10, right? So if you're going to use it someplace where it actually is giving your student a boost. You can apply to other schools. You just can't use early decision. So that other way, that early action or early application is your alternative. It actually does not limit how many times you can apply if you use EA, by contrast. And so that would be my recommendation. And the other thing I would tell you is don't use early decision if you cannot 100% afford full price at this school. Because at the end of the day, you've put all your eggs in a single basket. When you do that, there's no incentive for the school to discount your price. You just told them, I'm willing to pay full price because you haven't seen a price tag yet. You've only seen their full price, and they assume that's what you're coming for. So just know that. And early decision used to be used almost exclusively by schools that did not do scholarship dollars. It's not true anymore. So, so many schools are starting to lean into early decision because for the admissions group in the college, these are guaranteed butt-in chairs, which is why Tulane is suing this family because they planned on that student being there. And it has actual cost to the college. So at the end of the day, if you can't afford full fare, do not allow your student to fall in love with this school. Do not allow them to put their heart and soul into the application. If you can't afford it, use early action or regular decision. Here's what I will say. If you can afford full fare and you know the school is taking a higher percentage of freshman class out of early decision, it can give you a significant boost, right, at some schools. So if you're going to use it and you can afford it full price, make sure at least that it's giving you that bump. So as mentioned at the beginning, the schools that are now on the selective list continue to grow, and the schools that started selective and have been for decades are getting more and more and more selective. This list of schools that you can see in front of you, the acceptance rates listed here are pre-athlete. So before the athletes influence the outcome, you could cut most of these in half, just about. Stanford's post-athlete, post-legacy is closer to like 1.8%. So I think it's super important. I meet so many students. I'll tell them, hey, did you know that Harvard just has a 4% acceptance rate? And they go, yeah. And what I hear in my head is, so you're telling me there's a chance, right? That's what they're saying, right?
Uh-huh.
And I just remind them, if we put this in other contexts, if you ask someone out for the homecoming dance and they say back to you, sure, yes, absolutely, I will go with you. There's about a 4% shot that when you come to my door, I'll be there, but sure, I'll go. I'm not thinking you're thinking that you two go into this dance together, right? So it's important to put this in context for kids because they truly don't understand how challenging this is. The other thing I want to point out is what used to be kind of an Ivy specific or even a top 20 specific is not top 20 any longer, right? This goes down into almost the top 200 schools now. And it's not private specific either. You can see the bottom 3 schools. By the way, the University of Texas number that's on here is for non-residents. The resident number is much higher than this. But especially because because Texas has that, like if you're in the top 5% now, you get an auto excel, right? But I just want to point out that these are all public institutions. They're the flagship schools of their states, these bottom 3 schools. Now, the good news and interesting news is the flip side of this is that there are schools in the country where their acceptance rates are going up, not down. And this is where it's so important to point out that rigor and acceptance rate are not the same thing. They simply are not. Rigor has to do about the quality of education, right? And I don't believe anybody on the planet who tells me that the education you get out of Michigan State is going to be so much worse than the University of Michigan, right? 88% acceptance rate, 17% acceptance rate. What does University of Michigan have that Michigan State does not? Application volume. Everybody on the planet knows University of Michigan. Everybody on the planet has heard of University of Michigan. Everybody on the planet has heard of Harvard. Everybody on the planet's heard of Stanford, Duke, Rice, right? Name your highly selective school here. What those schools have is application volume. I get kids who say to me, like 80%, I'm not going to Temple. They take 80% of their applicants. Yep. They take 80% of a significantly smaller group of applications. It's super important to understand this. And probably the best example are the tier 2s, Boston College, BU, Tulane, Case Western, Wake Forest, Northeastern. Baylor is starting to fall into this category now. I think what keeps them out of it is the fact that they're in Waco, right? It's kind of in the middle of the state, kind of, not very urban, for instance. I'll be kind. But the tier 2s pre-COVID had acceptance rates in the 20 to 30% range. That's what made them a tier 2. They now, post-COVID, are all sitting under 15%. What changed? Test optional. That's what changed. Once these schools went test optional, they got a huge influx of applications. That huge influx of applications with the same size freshman classes, right, pushed down those acceptance rates. They're taking fewer of the higher volume of applications. Those schools did not suddenly get more rigorous. They're not suddenly way harder than they were pre-COVID. They're the exact same schools that they were pre-COVID. So it's really important to understand that rigor and acceptance rate, not the same at all. I also just want to give people an understanding of what getting into schools looks like today, because so many kids, I meet so many kids who, one, either think they're not going to college if they're a 3.0 kid, or I get the families where the 3.0 kid just wants to bounce down to the local flagship school and go to school. And there's nothing wrong with having a 3.0. That's a B. When did we decide Bs were no good? I was a total B student. But at the end of the day, what it does mean is that kid isn't probably going to get to bounce down to the local flagship school. Because again, application volume is artificially raising the average incoming GPA. Because if I get more applications, I can just take a broader swipe of those higher GPAs, right? And so what it's doing is kind of artificially inflating the average incoming GPA, but these are real GPAs. And the way that we see this happen, there's a huge kind of southern migration that's continuing. It's been going on for about 4 years now. And one of the big winners have been Clemson and Auburn. These are 2 schools, public schools, less than 15% acceptance rates in both those guys now. It's so hard to get into Clemson and Auburn today. New winners, Ole Miss and University of Tennessee. University of Tennessee pre-COVID had about an average incoming GPA of a 3.4, 3.46, something like that. They are now sitting at a 3.66. And that just has to do with application volume. Once again, they're the same school they were 5 years ago. My third tip, so acceptance is more than grades and test scores, right? So we just saw that grouping of grades, but here's the deal. If you are looking to go to, so if you're not in the top 5%, but still want to go to UT, you are now in that little bit lower acceptance rate group, right? Because at the end of the day, they take such a high volume of that top 5%. That's why it keeps dropping. By the way, it started top 10%, then it went top six, and last year it moved to top five. That's why it keeps moving, because they don't have room anymore for all of that. When you're looking at schools where these are the average incoming, if you're not that student, or if you are the 4 point plus and you want to go to UVA, you've got to do something more than just be smart. There's so many smart kids in the US. And so at the end of the day, I think it's really, really important to just understand, if you want to be a viable candidate for schools that have lower acceptance rates, you've got to do something extra. Passion project, science project, research project, community services project, something big, right? The stuff that we used to do, not a thing anymore. That's not enough to set you outside. Starting the new club at high school, that's not a thing anymore. I mean, it is, but it's not enough to set you apart in the big brand schools. Now, you might be sitting here going, Cozy, my kid does not care about any of that style school. I love that. Just make sure the student's activity list matches them, right? They don't need to go do something different, completely different than who they are. Colleges are not looking for well-rounded students. That's probably the biggest misperception that floats around on Facebook groups. They are looking to make a well-rounded campus. However, you cannot build an orchestra if all you have is flutes, right? You've got to have all the different parts and pieces. So if you've got the sport kid, great. They don't need to go join choir or be in the theater. If you've got the theater kid, they do not need to go find a sport they can tolerate for 5 seconds, right? Just make sure the activities really reflect who the student is. And if they want to stand out a little bit, they just take that thing and go deeper. And my last tip for you, and then we'll wrap this up and take your last questions. Testing does still matter. And in fact, it matters today more than ever. What doesn't matter to the schools is which test you take. In Texas, you lean into the SAT. The SAT is a much more challenging test in that it's an applied knowledge test. ACT is also available in the state of Texas. You just have to go seek it out. It's not given by your high schools. And so at the end of the day, SAT or ACT, the colleges don't care which one. They do very much care that you have a test score. Why? Because we see very clearly behind the scenes, even the test optional schools are accepting students with a score to share over kids that don't, because there was a study that came out a couple of years ago that demonstrated pretty compelling evidence, if you're a college, that test scores, not GPAs, are a better predictor of success. And that's partly because we've got a lot of artificially inflated GPAs. Kids can get a boost. They can hit a 5-point scale with honors classes, which are not technically college classes, versus AP or dual credit. So at the end of the day, the colleges are really leaning into these test scores. For that reason, I would get prep that fits your student. The one prep I don't recommend is the self-study out of the book. Get some kind of more formalized. It could be online. It could be a live tutor. It could be a small group live. There are lots of different ways to do this. I just don't recommend get the books and let your students self start. And then you can make decisions about sending the test score after you know for a fact you're all done taking the test. You want to make a really conscious choice about whether or not a school sees your test score. And you can't do that unless you go back in after the fact and register your schools after you're done taking your tests. So I want to leave you with this: search for success, not brand. College is a match. It should be a match that's made. It's not a prize, right? It gets to be a prize for one day when the kids videotape themselves, right? Film themselves and put it out on TikTok. It gets to be that for one day, but then they have to go off and be successful. So at the end of the day, really think about what kind of academic environment is going to suit my student most. Some schools are cutthroat, some are competitive, some are collaborative, some are very project-based, some are take tests at the end kind of schools. You can also choose your teaching format. There are experiential learning colleges. So if your student learns better hands-on, go seek that out. If your student's the better, like just give me the book and then I go take a test, seek that out. 80% of your kids are going to change their mind about their degree. If you want to shut down a college search, ask your student, what do you want to do? No, seriously, what do you want to do? I wouldn't go about it that way. They're going to change their mind about their major anyway. So really, truly, you want to think about this from the perspective of, okay, what's plan A, but also what's plan B and C, right? So seeking out schools where there are multiple degrees that speak to your students' academic strengths and interests. And then don't forget that college is sometimes the first time that really academically strong kid falls down and scrapes their knees. One of our consultants today at lunch was talking about her daughter got a 73% on her first test. I forget, she's some kind of crazy degree that's way above my pay grade. But her first test into the semester, she got a 73%. And she was devastated. She'd never gotten a 73% in her life. Talk about the fact that it's normal to get tutoring. It's normal to do study groups. It's normal to take advantage of the writing center. Seek those things out when you're touring. Seek those things out when you do orientation. Make sure your student knows before they're drowning that the average college student gets help. A little bit about us, and then I'll take your last questions. Colleges and industry, it used to change a little bit year to year, here and there. Now it seems like it changes literally every week. I'm not kidding about that. It's hard for us to keep up, let alone parents who have other things to do with their time. When we get to work with families, we do take you through the entirety of the process. So you've got, if you will, a Sherpa through the process. When we work with families, that 38% transfer rate drops to less than 4%. Right fit is the goal here. We can assure that the schools that make it to the list align with whatever the financial goals are that you and Dave have put together. But this is my favorite thing that we do. The owner of our company's son will be a 9th grader next year. And I said to him, Chris, are you going to do your own kids search? He goes, absolutely not. Because he's like, I just know, like, we're going to be here and here. It's not going to be good. So here's the coolest thing I want to offer to do. I do free consultations. I mentioned this at the beginning. I sit down with families literally every day but Sunday, and we just chat college. I'll answer your questions. We'll go through those 3 areas: academic, social, financial. If you have questions about how to think about high school, we can answer those. I can also help you understand the outcome of your FAFSA so you'll know. Would we qualify for need, or no, that's not really a thing for us. And if you want to talk more about how to be a viable candidate for highly selectives, that's also a good time to talk about that. So if you want to take advantage of that, if you have a sophomore or junior, or even this time of year, a senior, go ahead and use the QR code. It'll take you out to a Google form. And Alyssa, my admin, will reach out and get you on my calendar. If you want a copy of this presentation, I am always happy to share. And then please do follow us on Facebook. We put a ton of free content out there. We're getting ready to post an article on something called stacking. Stacking is when a college does or does not allow you to bring outside scholarships along, and whether they do or don't penalize you for doing that.
Well, man, this has been fantastic. I do have another question for you.
Sure.
I'll just read it instead of paraphrasing it. Our boys are already accepted to several colleges each and have received merit-based scholarship offers. At what point do we stop pushing for further aid?
So if you've gotten your full package, so one of the things that happens in this time of year is the colleges send the acceptance, and then I always say they send an opening salvo, which is the congrats, you're the recipient of the presidential scholarship for $7,000. That is probably not their last offer. And so what I would do is wait. Your students, when they applied, should have set up their student portal. So check in with them and see if they did that. If they did not do it, the time is now. Go get it set up. And then the school will actually converse with you about your financial award package through that portal. So once you go out and they've loaded a full financial package, which classically includes tuition, room and board, books, fees, personal expenses, and some schools include travel expenses. They should also reflect the federal student loan if you filled out your FAFSA. That's a full financial award, and it will also have then your scholarship dollars. Once that's locked and loaded, then you know you're done. Then you know you've got the full package. Until then, you don't. And so I would wait. Once you get that from all of your schools, then you know you're finished. And then sometimes you get the opportunity to appeal, which is to go back to the school and say, okay, look, this school's given us this, but we really want to go here. There's a little bit of a difference. Could you help us make this up? Public schools will not do this, so don't approach Texas Tech with this. They're not going to do that for you. But private schools will often do it. You have to have merit scholarship dollars in play, however, and they have to be schools that compete.
Great. Thank you, Cozy.
You bet.
I'm looking at our list, and I think that is the last one. So I'd like to thank you again for your time educating us on all of these different strategies. I know I learned a couple things, and if anyone on the webcast has questions, you're welcome to reach out to myself or Cozy, and we're happy to connect you together. Thank you again.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Dave, for the invitation.
You bet. Take care.